you think you might know about health and safety. Look, this isn't about ticking boxes. We're not here to talk about bureaucracy or filling out endless forms just to keep some regulator happy. This is about the real stakes. Welcome to the Foundation. This is the opening chapter of our Masterclass on the NEBOSH International General Certificate. And before we can ever get into the actual mechanics of how to manage health and safety, we really have to talk about why. Why are we here? Why does any of this matter? Well, let's dive right in, because the answer is profound, it's totally global, and frankly, it is quite literally a matter of life and death.
2.78 million. I want that number to just sink in for a moment. According to the International Labor Organization, that is the number of people who die every single year because of work-related accidents and diseases. 2.78 million empty chairs at dinner tables. And listen, that is just the fatalities. If you add to that the over 374 million non-fatal injuries, it's staggering. These aren't just statistics printed on a page, right? These are human beings. People who woke up, put on their boots, left for work in the morning, and just never came home. Or they came home forever changed. It brilliantly and tragically illustrates the profound human cost of organizational failure. When our safety systems break down, the price is paid in actual human suffering. And really, that brings us to the very first of three core pillars of why we manage safety, the moral duty of care. When things go wrong, a human tragedy unfolds right there on the ground. The moral argument is just that foundational ethical belief that it is simply the right thing to do. No worker, absolutely nobody, should ever have to sacrifice their physical or mental integrity just to earn a living to feed their family. Think about it. When an employer opens a business, they completely control the premises. They own the equipment, and they dictate the working processes. And because they hold all that control, they hold the direct, ethical responsibility to protect the people who are out there creating value for them. It's a fundamental social contract. But as history has shown us time and time again, relying purely on good intentions and moral duty, it's not always enough to stop a disaster.
Which brings us to pillar number 2, the unseen financial iceberg.
Look, if the moral argument speaks to the heart, this one speaks directly to the balance sheet. You see, accidents aren't just human tragedies. From a strictly business perspective, they are massive systemic errors. They waste precious resources, they grind operations to a halt, and they can legitimately threaten the survival of an organization. Managing health and safety is absolutely not just an overhead cost. It's a critical strategy to protect your profit margins and ensure your company actually survives. Now, when an incident happens, where does everyone's focus go? Immediately to the direct costs. These are the visible expenses. You can measure them, you can put them right there on a spreadsheet. Things like first aid treatment, worker sick pay, replacing a smashed up forklift, or paying a regulatory fine. But you know what? That is literally just the tip of the iceberg. The true devastation is lurking right below the surface, in the indirect costs. These are the hidden forces that just drag a business down. We're talking about a complete collapse of worker morale, which tanks your overall productivity. We're talking about massive operational disruption, the endless hours your supervisors spend investigating instead of producing, the heavy cost of recruiting and training temporary staff, and honestly, perhaps the most fatal of all, the sheer damage to your company's public image and the permanent loss of customer goodwill.
To put a scale on this, check out this insight from the UK's Health and Safety Executive. They found that uninsured losses are between 8 and 36 times greater than insured losses. So let's say a company has a serious incident. The direct costs, maybe they're covered by insurance, say a few $1,000,000. But those indirect costs we just talked about, the business interruption, the reputational ruin, those are almost entirely uninsured. In fact, one of our sources noted a specific UK fatality where the direct financial impact was estimated at £2.4 million. But once the operational disruption, regulatory time, and cultural consequences were fully accounted for, the indirect costs exceeded £10 million, more than 4 times the direct loss. It is that massive chunk of hidden ice below the waterline that truly sinks the ship.
Now, when morals and money aren't enough, society steps in. Pillar number 3, the legal framework. Societal expectations regarding the value of human life don't just stay as expectations. They are codified into hard, undeniable laws. We see this nationally and internationally through frameworks like the ILO's Convention C15. The legal consequences of failing your workers are severe, and rightly so. Breaching health and safety legislation is very often a criminal offence. We are not just talking about a little slap on the wrist or writing it off as the cost of doing business. Authorities can issue enforcement notices that immediately, on the spot, shut down your operations until you fix the problem. You can face catastrophic criminal fines that literally bankrupt the company. And crucially, this is a big one, individual managers and directors can face prosecution and actual time in prison. The law demands accountability.
So, here is the million-dollar question we inevitably arrive at. Organizations know the moral cost. They know about the financial ruin waiting below the surface. They are fully aware of the severe legal threats and the risk of going to prison. And yet, people still die. Workplaces still suffer catastrophic incidents. Why? Why do we normalize deviation? Why do human beings who absolutely know the rules and understand the risks actively bypass them? This is where the psychology of safety becomes absolutely fascinating. It takes us right out of the corporate boardroom and dumps us into the gritty, everyday reality of the workplace.
Let's dive in to how these perfectly engineered safety systems actually break down on the factory floor, because it happens through really insidious, everyday human behaviors driven by pressure and workplace culture. First, you have the non-reporting of hazards. Workers see a near miss, but they're terrified of being blamed, or they just cynically assume management won't actually fix it anyway, so they stay silent. Then there's selective compliance. One of our sources highlighted a noise survey at a metal fabrication plant where 60% of the workers in a grinding bay had their hearing protection hanging around their necks instead of actually in their ears. They wear the hard hat because the supervisor can easily spot it from a distance, but they skip the earplugs. Or consider bypassing safety devices entirely, taking a guard off a machine to clear a jam just a little bit faster, or defeating a safety interlock with a 5-cent zip tie just to keep production rolling. Over time, taking those dangerous shortcuts basically becomes the new standard practice. We call this the normalization of deviance. A procedure that legally requires 3 people gets done by 2 because, hey, we've always done it this way and nothing bad has happened yet. Right up until the day it does. Now, when that inevitable disaster finally strikes, the immediate knee-jerk instinct of an organization is to just fire the worker who used the zip tie. Problem solved, right? Wrong. Here is the golden rule of this masterclass. Blaming the individual completely neglects the root causes. Individual unsafe acts are almost always just symptoms of a much deeper systemic failure. You have to ask, why did the worker use the zip tie in the first place? Were they under extreme production pressure from leadership? Did the company's reward system actively incentivize speed and output over safety? Did supervisors casually walk past that bypassed guard every single day and turn a blind eye as long as the quotas were met? The real root causes lie deep within organizational design, a toxic blame culture, and fundamental management failure. If you just fire the worker, you haven't fixed the system at all. You have quite literally just set a trap for the very next person who clocks in. So how do we fix it? It requires a total culture shift. Reactive versus proactive. This brings us to the fundamental cultural shift every world-class organization has to make if they actually want to survive and protect their people. We have to entirely change how we look at the timeline of an accident. Look, reactive monitoring is essentially like driving your car down the highway while exclusively looking in the rearview mirror. It relies entirely on lagging indicators. You are literally just waiting for the system to fail, counting the injuries, investigating the accidents, and trying to learn your lessons after the blood has already been spilled. Is it necessary? Yes, of course, but it's too late. Proactive monitoring, on the other hand, is looking right through the windshield. It uses leading indicators. You are actively auditing the system, conducting safety tours, checking those machine guards, and intervening long before the tragedy strikes. It is the fundamental difference between investigating a house fire and just checking the batteries in your smoke alarms. And the absolute ultimate weapon in a proactive culture? It's this: near-miss reporting. A near miss is essentially a free lesson from the universe. It's an event that absolutely could have caused harm, but didn't, purely by sheer luck. But to actually capture those vital lessons, you have to foster a culture of profound psychological safety, a culture of real awareness and accountability, where workers feel completely empowered to report risks and even admit their own mistakes, entirely without the fear of blame or punishment. When you start treating every near miss as a highly valuable piece of risk intelligence rather than a punishable offense, that's when you gain the superpower to control risks before they turn into actual injuries or fatalities. So we know the catastrophic human toll. We know the financial and legal ruin that is waiting for those who fail. We've seen how fragile human psychology makes our systems, and we know without a shadow of a doubt that we absolutely must be proactive, not reactive. But the ultimate question still remains: how do we actually build this system from the ground up? How do we design a framework that practically guarantees these standards are met, day in and day out across massively complex operations? Well, that is exactly what we are going to uncover next. Let's turn the page and step right into element 2. So, we've established the sheer weight of the moral and financial stakes in workplace safety. Knowing exactly why we must protect human life, well, that's foundational, absolutely crucial. But honestly, it's really just the beginning. Now, we have to actually build the architecture that makes that protection possible. Element 2, the engine of safety. Because you have to ask yourself, how do we turn this genuine desire for safety into a living, breathing reality out there on the factory floor? And I'll tell you right now, it is not with some dry, dusty, bureaucratic manual just sitting on a manager's shelf. No, we do it by building a health and safety management system. And I want you to think of this less like a collection of papers and more like the beating engine of your daily operations. You see, a health and safety management system is essentially a structured set of interrelated components that allow an organization to manage risks and actually achieve its safety objectives. Without a system like this, well, safety is really just unpredictable guesswork. You're basically crossing your fingers and hoping nobody gets hurt today. But by integrating these structured components, that protection becomes controlled, it becomes deliberate, and, most importantly, it becomes measurable.
Section 1, the core framework, building the PDCA cycle.
Now, this engine runs on a universally recognized architecture. It's called the Plan, Do, Check, Act, or PDCA Continuous Improvement Cycle, which you'll find powering major standards like ISO 45001. But here's the thing. The absolute most critical component here isn't a process. It's people. Look closely and you'll see leadership and worker participation sitting right at the absolute heart of this framework. Because the system doesn't just run itself, right? Human beings drive it forward.
Let's break this down. Imagine bringing a massive, highly dangerous piece of heavy machinery onto a busy factory floor. First, you plan. You don't just plug the thing in, you assess the risks, you set your safe operating procedures. Second, you do, meaning you train your operators and you actually run the machine safely. Third, you check. You're out there actively monitoring noise levels, making sure the rules are actually being followed. And finally, you act. If you find a flaw, you take immediate action to fix it. And boom, the cycle begins anew. But listen, planning never happens in a vacuum. To really succeed, you have to understand the steeple model. This is the broader context your business operates in. Social, technological, economic, environmental, political, legal, and ethical pressures. These are constantly influencing your safety engine. Think about it. A sudden economic downturn slashes your budget, or maybe a new legal regulation shifts your compliance requirements. You literally have to engineer your system for the real world with all its messy variables. Which brings us to a rather hard truth from the Health and Safety Executive Guidelines, and it's this. Focusing too much on the formal documentation will distract you from the human elements. So why do these theoretically perfect, beautifully designed systems frequently fail in the real world? Why are people still getting hurt when we have these comprehensive risk assessments sitting right there on the desk? That brings us to Section 2, the human element, why safety systems fail. I want you to let this number sink in for a second. 10 to 20%. That is the reality of most health and safety reporting systems. They only actually engage about 10 to 20% of the workforce. Think about what that really means. It means up to 80% of your people are completely silent. If you're sitting up in a boardroom relying solely on those formal reports, man, you are managing a dangerously distorted view of reality. So why the silence? Well, the common barriers to safety are largely cultural and systemic. First up, the blame game. If workers fear punishment for reporting a near miss, I guarantee you they will hide it. Then there's poor safety culture, a culture that implicitly values production speed over human life. Add in things like tools that are just way too difficult to use for reporting, one-way communication from the top down, and serious financial constraints, and you've got yourself a lethal recipe for fatal workarounds. To actually break these barriers, effective safety requires visible leadership and genuine two-way worker consultation. Sending out a company-wide memo, that's not going to save a life. Top management literally must drive the culture out there on the floor. And they have to aggressively protect workers from any kind of reprisal when they do speak up. You have to consult your people. Why? Because the worker turning the wrench always knows the hazards far better than the manager sitting behind the desk. Every single time.
Let's move to Section 3, the dashboard. Active versus reactive monitoring.
Okay, so now we're entering the check phase of our engine. And to do this, we need to look at a stark comparison. active monitoring versus reactive monitoring. The easiest way to think about it is this. Active monitoring is catching the spark before the fire. Reactive monitoring, that's analyzing the ashes after the building has already burned down. So let's look at active monitoring examples. We're talking about safety tours, rigorous workplace inspections, checking compliance with safe systems and environmental monitoring. This is all about proactively hunting for evidence. You're looking for solid proof that your precautions are functioning perfectly before anyone gets hurt. It's walking that factory floor to ensure the machine guards are locked in today, just so nobody loses a finger tomorrow.
And then, on the other side, we have reactive monitoring examples. This includes accident investigations, analyzing ill health data, hazard reports, and dealing with civil claims. This is essentially utilizing the tragic aftermath as an indicator of your system's failure. Look, we absolutely must learn from these devastating events, but make no mistake, if your organization is solely relying on reactive monitoring, your system has already failed someone.
Now, to prevent that fatal trap of complacency, we bring in auditing. Officially, auditing is the systematic, objective, critical evaluation of how well an organization's management system performed by examining evidence. In plain English, it means bringing in an independent, highly critical set of eyes to examine the hard facts. You're making sure your management system hasn't secretly devolved into a meaningless paperweight. Which brings us right to the final step in our cycle, ACT, the relentless loop of continuous improvement. You see, whether we find a minor little flaw during a routine inspection, a massive systemic gap during an audit, or, God forbid, we suffer a devastating accident, we must act. We implement the fix, we update the policies, and the planning cycle begins again. The engine never, ever stops turning. So we have built the framework. We've engineered this living, breathing system powered by human engagement and relentless monitoring. The engine is officially running. But here's the ultimate question. How do we navigate the unpredictable hazards on the road ahead? How do we actually identify those invisible, absolutely lethal dangers lurking in human behavior and complex processes before they strike? Well, that is exactly what we are going to conquer next.
We've built the framework. We've set the policies. We know exactly what health and safety management looks like on paper. But now we step into element 3, the do phase. Because let's be honest, a plan is literally just a piece of paper until people actually bring it to life. We just mapped out all these brilliant strategies in the plan phase, right? But here is the gritty reality. The do phase is the actual battleground. This is where your well-intentioned boardroom strategies leave the desk and collide with the most unpredictable force on Earth, human behavior. Out here, execution isn't just important, it's everything.
Defining the threat, hazard versus risk.
Okay, let's dive into this. Before we can protect people, we have to correctly diagnose what can actually hurt them. And people mix up these two words all the time. But in our worlds, getting this distinction right is a matter of life and death. So what's the difference? Well, a hazard is simply a condition with the potential to cause harm. Picture a thick, high-voltage cable trailing across a wet workshop floor. That's the hazard. The risk, however, is the likelihood combined with the severity of that harm actually happening. So the risk is the high probability of a worker tripping over that cable and the severe outcome, like a fractured skull. We manage risks, sure, but we literally cannot do that until we accurately identify the hazards.
And that brings us to the general risk assessment cycle. Listen, a suitable and sufficient risk assessment is never just a compliance checklist that you quickly fill out and shove in a desk drawer. No way. It's a living, breathing diagnostic loop. We identify the hazards, we pinpoint exactly who might get hurt, we evaluate the controls we already have, implement new ones, record what we find, and then, crucially, we review it constantly. The whole goal here is proactive survival. We want to establish the controls before the accident ever has a chance to happen.
Human factors, the perception gap. Here is the terrifying truth about execution. You could have the most flawlessly documented risk assessment in the world, and it will completely fail if you ignore human psychology. You see, workers can easily become hazard blind to everyday dangers. It's like becoming nose blind to a smell in your house, but with potentially fatal consequences. If a workplace has constant, excessive noise or extreme heat, it creates physical fatigue and cognitive overload. A worker might literally just not hear a warning alarm or notice a massive forklift reversing right behind them. So how do we fix this? By actively removing those environmental distractions, by visually highlighting hazards with bright, high-visibility paint and proper lighting. We bridge that perception gap by engineering an environment where it is practically impossible to ignore the danger.
The shields, hierarchy of controls. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it ranks our safeguards. Once a risk is identified, we need a strategic defense mechanism. This is an inverted triangle, moving from the absolute most effective strategy at the top down to the weakest at the bottom. Our first move? Always try to eliminate the hazard entirely. Just get rid of it. If we can't do that, we try to substitute it for something safer. Next, we look at engineering controls, literally building a physical barrier between the people and the danger. If that doesn't work, we shift to administrative controls, fundamentally changing the way people work through rules. And at the absolute very bottom, personal protective equipment, PPE. Now, why is the iconic hard hat at the bottom? Because it relies 100% on human compliance. If a worker forgets to put their safety glasses on, your shield is completely gone.
Let's ground this theoretical framework in reality. Imagine you've got a dangerously loud air compressor on a shop floor. Following our hierarchy, the absolute best control is elimination at the source. Just buy a new whisper-quiet compressor, right? But okay, let's say management says there's no budget for that. So we step down to engineering controls. We build an acoustic enclosure, basically putting that noisy machinery into its own soundproofed room. If it's still too loud when workers go in there for maintenance, then we fall back on the least effective controls, administratively rotating the workers so they aren't exposed for too long, and, as an absolute last resort, handing out earplugs.
The guardrails, safe systems, and permits.
In heavy industries, think construction or oil and gas, some tasks are just inherently dangerous. We literally cannot engineer the hazards away entirely. So we shift our strategy. We manage these high-stakes, unavoidable hazards using strict administrative guardrails. The foundation of this is a Safe System of Work, or SSOW. When we can't eliminate a hazard, we take that complex, dangerous activity and break it down into crystal clear, universally understandable instructions. It's the definitive blueprint. It ensures that a routine but dangerous task is performed safely, exactly the same way by every single employee.
However, for the truly extreme, high-stakes risks, standard systems just aren't going to cut it. We're talking about confined space entry, hot work that could trigger a massive explosion, or working on live, high-voltage systems. For these scenarios, we demand a formal permit to work. Think of a permit not as a form, but as a strict, legally binding safety contract. It absolutely must be authorized before a single tool is lifted.
This permit system operates through 4 critical life cycle stages. First, the issue. A highly competent authorizer defines the strict precautions needed, like mandatory gas testing or physical lockouts. Second, receipt. The worker signs off, legally acknowledging they understand the immense risks and will follow the rules. Third, clearance. Once the job is done, the worker formally confirms the area is safe and the equipment can be turned back on. And finally, cancellation. The authorizer officially terminates the permit. It is a closed, tight loop that demands flawless compliance.
But remember, and this is absolutely crucial, success here is never about the sheer volume of paperwork you can generate. When a worker is suspended 50 feet in the air, relying on these systems, the paperwork is not going to catch them if they fall. This is about visible leadership. It's about competent authorization and the tangible physical reduction of risk to protect human life. The paperwork is simply there to ensure the guardrails stay intact.
The worst-case scenario, emergency procedures. As safety professionals, we have to look reality in the eye. What actually happens when the guardrails break? What happens when human error or a catastrophic equipment failure completely bypasses every single control we just talked about? We have a massive moral and legal duty to plan for foreseeable emergencies. We're talking fires, massive chemical spills, bomb threats. In these moments of terror, automatic, deeply rehearsed responses are quite literally all that stand between chaos and survival. We absolutely need strict arrangements for raising the alarm, conducting smooth evacuation drills, and instantly contacting emergency services. Because when things go wrong, panic is the absolute enemy of survival. Preparation is the only antidote. And this brilliantly illustrates why we have to prepare our physical environments for those critical seconds immediately following an incident. A thorough first aid needs assessment will dictate exactly what emergency equipment needs to be instantly accessible. Think about an emergency eye wash station. It's not just a colorful piece of wall decoration, it is a strategically placed lifeline. It's designed to mitigate permanent, catastrophic harm the very second a chemical splash occurs.
But beyond the physical equipment, we rely on the ultimate safety net, trained first aid personnel. These are the people who step directly into the chaos. Their vital role during a nightmare scenario is defined by the 3 Ps: preserving life,
preventing the casualty's condition from getting any worse and promoting recovery. They step up to stabilize the situation until professional medical assistance can finally take over.
So look at what we've done. We have transformed our paper plans into physical action. We've built the safe systems of work, we've navigated the tricky complexities of human psychology, and we've deployed the hierarchy of controls. We are aggressively executing the do phase. But execution without observation is really just blind faith. How do we actually know that any of these controls are working in the real world? Are we really as safe as our paperwork claims we are? Well, that is exactly the mystery we need to unpack next as we step into element 4.
We just spent element 3 building the machine, right? We took the plan and pushed it straight into action with the do phase. Policies are written, training is done, controls are live, and your people are out there doing the actual work. The system is humming along beautifully. But now we've got to pause, and we have to ask ourselves a deeply uncomfortable question. Are our people actually safe? Or, are we just getting lucky? Let's talk about element 4, health and safety management systems. Check.
So this brings us to the ultimate reality test. On one side, we have the theory, the plan. That's our perfect little world where everybody follows the rules, equipment literally never breaks down, and fatigue just magically doesn't exist. But then there's the reality, the check. This is the gritty truth of what's actually happening out there on the factory floor, on the construction site, or in the office. This element, it's designed to completely shatter the illusion of safety, because checking is basically the sensory nervous system of your whole organization. Without it, you are completely blind to your actual risk profile.
Okay, let's dive into this. Looking at our classic plan, do, check, act framework, we are right down here at the bottom, the check phase. This single step is what validates that entire theoretical safety net we just built. It's the diagnostic process. It proves whether our controls are actually translating into tangible, physical protection for the workforce, or if, well, they're just fancy documents gathering dust on some manager's shelf. There's this absolutely profound quote by the physicist Lord Kelvin, and I think it hits the nail right on the head here. If you cannot measure, your knowledge is meager and unsatisfactory. I mean, wow. In occupational health and safety, hope is definitely not a strategy. Without a totally exhaustive, systematic approach to monitoring and measuring performance, you don't actually know your risk profile. You are, quite literally, just relying on luck. So how do we systematically measure the reality of our workplace? Well, that brings us to Section 1, Active Monitoring, Preventing Failure. To stop failure in its tracks, we have to proactively seek out the truth before disaster strikes. And we do this using what we call leading indicators. Basically, these are predictive signals. They tell us the likely future direction of our safety performance. Honestly, think of them like the headlights on your car. If you've got a high number of risk assessments being completed, packed attendance at your safety inductions, and routine inspections that are finding minor issues and actually fixing them, well, those leading indicators point to a future where accidents are highly unlikely to happen. We're checking that standards are met before an unwanted event ever gets the chance to occur. So one of the best and most common active monitoring tools is the systematic inspection. And a really great way to structure these inspections is to break your physical workplace down into 4 critical areas. We call them the 4 Ps. First up, plant. This is checking the actual machinery and vehicles. Second is premises. This means looking at the working environment, the lighting, the floors, the whole shebang. Third, people. Actually observing working methods and behaviors. And finally, procedures. Verifying that things like permits to work and safe systems are actually being followed in reality. By actively surveying these 4 pillars, we trap hazards while they're still just hazards. And this brilliantly illustrates what proactive control looks like in reality. Notice how active monitoring is fundamentally a line management function. It's not just some health and safety officer ticking a box on a clipboard in the background. No, it's a direct supervisor having a conversation, verifying competence, and checking machine integrity before the work even begins. It's proactive control in action, and it's absolutely crucial. Which takes us to Section 2, Reactive Monitoring, Analyzing Failure. But look, we have to be honest with ourselves here. No system is perfect, controls fail, people make mistakes, it happens. So what happens when the truth is faced only after the damage is done? That's when we turn to lagging indicators. If leading indicators were your headlights, lagging indicators are your rear-view mirrors. They measure past performance by looking at accidents, cases of work-related ill health, dangerous occurrences, and of course, near misses. Yes, it absolutely means reacting after things have gone wrong. And yes, it measures failure. But
This reactive monitoring provides totally invaluable hard empirical data. It shines this harsh, undeniable light on the systemic weaknesses that your active monitoring completely missed.
To really understand why this matters, we look to the accident ratio pyramid. Studies have shown time and again that for every single catastrophic major injury sitting at the very top of that pyramid, there are a predictable number of minor injuries and a vast, massive base of near misses. A near miss is basically an event that had the potential to cause serious harm, but just didn't. We just got lucky. If we want to stop that fatality at the top, we have to fiercely investigate those near misses at the bottom. By focusing our energy on that vast bottom slice, we drastically reduce the statistical probability of a major event ever happening.
But, just collecting raw numbers of incidents isn't really enough. Think about it. 5 accidents in a tiny company of 10 people. That's catastrophic. But 5 accidents in a massive company of 10,000 people? That's a totally different story. So we have to convert this raw data into rates, like the accident incidence rate or the lost time accident frequency rate. Doing this allows us to track really meaningful trends over time. Like, are we actually improving year over year? Are there weird seasonal patterns? Is one specific department a total hotspot for injuries? We use these rates to find out exactly where the system is bleeding.
Moving into Section 3, investigating the root cause.
Once the data shows us that a failure actually occurred, we transition into some deep detective work. So the crucial point is this golden rule. An investigation is about repairing broken systems. It is never about hunting culprits. The absolute quickest way to destroy your safety data is to build a blame culture. Because if workers fear disciplinary action, what are they going to do? They're going to hide their near misses, they'll sweep incidents right under the rug, and you will lose the exact information you desperately need to prevent someone from getting seriously hurt tomorrow. Remember, we investigate to learn, not to punish. A professional incident investigation basically follows 4 strict chronological steps. First up, gather information. This means you secure the scene, you take your photos, and you interview witnesses with a totally open mind. Second, analyze that information to draw real conclusions about what happened. Third, identify suitable control measures to actually fix the problem. And fourth, plan remedial actions, meaning you assign clear responsibilities and timescales so those fixes are actually implemented in the real world. That second step, the analysis, is so critical because it forces us to separate the symptoms from the actual disease. We have the immediate cause, which is usually the obvious unsafe act or condition, a missing machine guard or a spill on the floor. But then we have the root cause, which is the underlying management failure. Like, why was that guard missing in the first place? Was there a total lack of supervision, poor maintenance protocols, or maybe some unrealistic production targets pushing people to cut corners? If you only fix the immediate cause, if you literally just mop up the spill, that underlying root cause guarantees that the exact same incident is going to happen again. And that brings us to Section 4, auditing the whole system. To evaluate the health of the entire organizational organism, we have to zoom way out to auditing. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the critical and honestly often misunderstood distinction between an inspection and an audit. An inspection is just checking the physical reality of the workplace, like, is the fire extinguisher in date? Are the walkways clear? But an audit is evaluating the management system that lies behind that reality. An audit asks, do we actually have a functioning procurement and maintenance system that ensures those fire extinguishers are always bought, checked, and replaced on time? Ultimately, auditing is a highly structured, systematic process of collecting independent information. It's designed to verify the efficiency, effectiveness, and the reliability of your total health and safety management system. It's an objective, critical evaluation of exactly how well the organization is performing against its own internal standards and, of course, legal requirements. But listen, a truly competent auditor doesn't just sit at a desk reviewing piles of paperwork. To find the real truth, they seek evidence through 3 distinct channels. First, they review the documents and records just to see what the organization claims it does. Second, they conduct interviews with personnel at all levels to see what workers actually understand. And third, they use direct observation to see what physically happens out there on the floor. Think about it. If the written policy says one thing, but the workers say another, and the physical reality shows a third entirely different thing, well, that auditor has just found a massive critical gap in your system. Organizations eventually have to decide who is going to conduct this critical evaluation. An internal audit uses staff from right within the organization. Obviously, they have deep business knowledge and it's pretty cost-effective, but they might lack a bit of objectivity.
An external audit, on the other hand, brings in an outside expert. They provide a completely independent, fresh pair of eyes, and their recommendations usually carry a lot more weight with senior leadership. Though, yeah, they can be expensive and they might not intimately understand your specific industry's quirks. A truly robust organization, they'll usually utilize a solid mix of both.
So we have reached a critical juncture here. Through our active monitoring, reactive data, deep dive investigations, and rigorous audits, we've extracted the truth. We have the data. We know exactly what is working, and more importantly, we know exactly what's broken. So, the ultimate question that ends this check phase is simply this: what are you going to do about it? Let's move to and see how this builds, setting the stage for the action-oriented management review of Element 5.
All right, so you've just successfully navigated the check phase of our health and safety management system. You've monitored, you've investigated, and you've gathered this absolute mountain of crucial data. But here is the hard truth of this masterclass. All of that exhaustive data collection, it means absolutely nothing without decisive action. And that brings us right into Element 5. This is where we cross the bridge from just identifying problems to fundamentally fixing them. Welcome to the ACT phase. I want you to think about that for a second. Data without action is literally just a list of future regrets. We are stepping into the absolute climax of the plan, do, check, act cycle right now. I need you to view this ACT phase not as some administrative paperwork or a corporate formality. No, this is the ultimate moment where true leadership, accountability, and your organizational culture get tested. If the check phase was the diagnosis, well, the ACT phase is the cure. Taking a look at the ISO 45001 framework, you can see exactly where we are on our map. Notice how ACT, or improvement, interacts directly with planning, doing, and checking. It's the engine that drives continual improvement. It grabs the lessons we learn from our performance evaluations and injects them right back into the heartbeat of the organization, ensuring that tomorrow's baseline is much safer than today's.
Section 1. The Management Review. The Boardroom Reality Check. To make that systemic improvement actually happen, we need a formal mechanism. We have to take that raw safety data out of the filing cabinet, walk it straight into the boardroom, and transform it into high-level strategic decisions. We call this the Management Review. The Health and Safety Executive's HSG 65 guidance puts it perfectly. Organizations can maintain and improve their ability to manage risks by learning from experience. Now, what's really interesting here is the operative word, learning. A management review is definitely not a calendar invite to tick a compliance box. It is a continuous, systemic process of learning and evolving. It's senior leaders looking in the mirror and honestly asking, are our strategies actually working? Okay, let's dive into this. To answer that question, leaders need the right intelligence. During a review, management must analyze a massive array of inputs. We're talking about lagging indicators like accident trends and Ritador reports, right alongside leading indicators like audit findings. But it doesn't stop at internal metrics. They absolutely must review changes in legal standards, and crucially, they have to listen to worker feedback and external complaints. This is the raw intelligence required to understand an organization's true safety posture.
But inputs are only half the equation, right? The ACT phase demands outputs. This intelligence has to be converted into tangible, strategic actions to actually close the loop. If the review identifies, say, a spike in manual handling injuries, the output isn't just a note in the meeting minutes. No way. The output is a revised health and safety policy, it's a reallocation of financial resources to buy better lifting equipment, it's updated risk assessments, and it's the setting of new, smart performance targets.
Section 2. The Power of Audits. Beyond the Surface. So how does a boardroom actually know their beautifully written policies are being followed out there on the factory floor? How do they verify the system? Well, they do it through the power of audits. And let's be crystal clear on the definition here. A health and safety audit is a systematic, objective, and critical evaluation of the entire occupational health and safety management system. It is not a casual walk around to spot trip hazards. It is a deep, critical appraisal by a competent, often independent auditor assessing the actual reliability of your management framework.
There is a vital distinction here that honestly a lot of people get wrong. An inspection is tactical, an audit is strategic. An inspection is a supervisor checking if a fire extinguisher is in its proper place this week. An audit, on the other hand, is an independent expert reviewing your procurement documents, interviewing your staff, and checking your maintenance logs to ensure your entire system for managing fire safety actually works year-round. Inspections find immediate faults. Audits find systemic failures.
And this all builds into a highly structured life cycle.
An audit is practically an objective science. It begins with objective setting, defining the scope and the standard, like ISO 45001. Then comes information gathering, which uses a triangulation of interviews, document reviews, and direct observations. This naturally leads to reporting, where nonconformances are laid bare for everyone to see. And finally, it results in action planning, feeding directly back into our ACT phase to drive those essential corrective measures we just talked about.
Section 3. Accountability at the top. The legal stakes.
What happens when an organization fails to act? What happens when audits are ignored and management reviews are just rubber-stamping exercises? Well, we enter the realm of human tragedy and severe legal consequence. The crucial point here is understanding the stark difference between responsibility and accountability. They are absolutely not the same thing. Responsibility is about the task. A managing director can delegate the responsibility of conducting a risk assessment to a safety officer. Sure, but accountability, the ultimate non-transferable legal liability for the system's success or failure, always remains at the top. You can outsource a task, but you cannot outsource a prison sentence.
To anchor this in reality, we have to look at the tragic 2008 case of R.V. Chargot Limited. On a construction site, a worker was fatally crushed when his dumper truck overturned. This wasn't just a tragic accident. It was a fundamental systemic failure that put the company and its managing director on criminal trial under the Health and Safety at Work Act.
The Chargot case proved without a doubt that simply assuming safety is not enough. The managing director assumed the site was safe but completely failed to verify it. He failed to effectively review the health and safety systems. Essentially, he failed the ACT phase. And the courts ruled that ultimate accountability sat squarely on his shoulders, resulting in a severe prosecution. It is a sobering, very real reminder that leadership must actively engage with and verify their safety systems.
Section 4. Driving continual improvement. The excellence mindset.
From the heavy consequences of failure, we have to pivot to the blueprint for success. How do we build a resilient, high-performing safety culture that ensures cases like Chargot never, ever happen? It requires embracing the excellence mindset and driving continual improvement. I want you to ask yourself this exact question when looking at any safety intervention. Are we just fixing immediate problems, or are we fundamentally improving the system? Putting a bucket under a leaky roof, well, that's a fix. Replacing the roof, that's an improvement. The ACT phase demands we stop merely reacting to compliance failures and start proactively engineering excellence.
To engineer that excellence, we have to look through the right windshield. Lagging indicators like injury rates and days lost are essential, for sure, but they are entirely reactive. They just tell you how many people you've already hurt. It's exactly like driving while only looking in the rearview mirror. Leading indicators, however, things like audit closeout rates, training percentages, and near-miss reports, those are proactive. They give you predictive power, telling you exactly how well your system is working before an accident ever happens.
And when those indicators tell us we need to act, we apply the hierarchy of controls. The corrective actions generated in our management reviews must systematically apply this model. We don't just jump straight to handing out personal protective equipment. That is our last, absolutely weakest line of defense. We act by trying to physically reduce the risk. Can we eliminate the hazard entirely? Can we substitute it? Can we use engineering controls to physically isolate the worker? Because that is how real structural safety is built.
By acting decisively, by holding our leaders accountable, and by engineering out those hazards, we successfully close the loop. But here's the beauty of it. The cycle doesn't stop. It seamlessly loops back onto itself. The corrective actions and the brand new targets we set today in the ACT phase, they literally become the baseline for tomorrow's plan phase. The pursuit of safety is a wheel that never, ever stops turning.
So we have built the perfect framework. We know exactly how to plan, do, check, and act. But here is the ultimate variable. What happens when our meticulously designed management system collides with the fragile, completely unpredictable realities of the human mind and body on the front line? As we transition seamlessly into Element 6, we are going to leave the safety of the boardroom behind and dive deep into the intense world of physical and psychological hazards. Get ready.
So, you've built your management system. You mapped out the grand plan back in Element 5, and, well, the ink is finally dry on your health and safety policy. But right now, we have to confront a pretty dangerous illusion, and that's the reality of operational pressure. Because, let's be honest, a beautifully written policy sitting in a binder, it has never, ever stopped an incident on a rainy Tuesday afternoon when everyone is rushing and the stakes are impossibly high. How do we actually turn that written intention into a physical, breathing reality?
Well, that is exactly what we're tackling here in Element 6, Organizing for Health and Safety.
Let's drive straight into this critical gap, the space between the imagined safety of a neat little document and the complex, frankly messy human reality out there on the ground. Just picture this for a second. What happens when a major client is absolutely screaming for a delayed order, and right at that exact moment, a critical piece of machinery needs mandatory maintenance? When safety and production inevitably collide like that, whatever happens next dictates your true safety culture. Because if you don't have pre-agreed ironclad escalation protocols, like the documented authority for someone to literally pull the cord and stop work, production is going to win by default every single time, regardless of what your glossy policy claims.
And that brings us to a brilliantly simple yet brutal truth. Workers observe what leaders do, not what they sign. Think about that for a second. Actually, let that really sink in. Organizing for health and safety, it is not a paperwork exercise. It's the behavioral and psychological engineering of your entire company. Visible leadership behaviors, like a director genuinely participating in a floor walk or getting their hands dirty in an incident investigation, those actions build an invisible currency called credibility, and their absence, well, it bankrupts your safety culture overnight.
Now, to make this work, accountability cannot be vague. It must cascade, completely uninterrupted, from the managing director straight down to the frontline supervisors. You literally cannot just wave your hand at the whole company and declare, hey, safety is everyone's job. Why? Because human psychology dictates that if a critical task belongs to everyone, it effectively belongs to no one, right? We have to establish a rigid, clearly defined framework of management control, ensuring that every single individual knows their exact responsibilities and their precise place within the machinery of the organization.
So let's look at the very peak of that framework. Top management commitment. True leadership means far more than drafting a nice vision statement for the lobby. It means putting real skin in the game. It means ensuring the actual availability of resources, human, infrastructure, and financial. We're talking about a CEO allocating budgets to fix hazards without demanding an agonizing 20-page ROI business case for every single safety improvement. Top management must appoint competent people, and crucially, they have to step out of the boardroom to actively see if their objectives are actually surviving contact with the real world. Moving down the chain, we reach the absolute linchpins of the whole operation, your middle managers and supervisors. Honestly, these middle tiers are the crucible where your culture is actually forged. They are the ones absorbing the immense daily friction between the boardroom's production demands and safe working procedures. Supervisors are the ones providing the vital close supervision. They're out there conducting the risk assessments, identifying the silent training gaps, and investigating the near misses. They are the translators, turning top management's idealized vision into the gritty, daily reality of operations.
So how do we transform a generic, static policy into a robust, living system across all these different levels? Well, we have to architect 4 core behavioral pillars deeply into the organization's DNA. We call these the 4 C's of organizing: competence, control, cooperation, and communication. And listen, these are not just corporate buzzwords. These are the actual engines that dictate whether your people go home safe from the factory floor, the construction site, or the office at the end of the day.
Let's isolate that first pillar, competence. In our field, we define this with a handy acronym, CATE. That stands for knowledge, ability, training, and experience. And here is the brutal truth about this. A pristine framed training certificate does not equal competence. Not even close. Competence is whether a worker can actually apply that knowledge under extreme operational stress. Sure, someone might easily pass a multiple choice test in a quiet, air-conditioned classroom, but can they safely lock out a massive machine when it's 3 a.m., alarms are blaring, they are deeply fatigued, and the shift manager is tapping their watch? That level of execution requires ongoing assessment and real, battle-tested experience.
Next up, we must face how we actually engage our workforce through communication and cooperation. Look, there is a stark, dangerous difference between simply informing your workers and genuinely consulting them. Information? That's a one-way street. It's broadcasting rules, slapping up posters in the break room, sending out blanket emails. It breeds a totally passive, disengaged culture. Consultation, on the other hand, is a two-way dialogue. It's sitting down, looking workers in the eye, listening to their ground-level reality, and, here's the kicker, allowing their input to actively alter decisions before a plan is ever finalized.
But we have to acknowledge that effective communication is an incredibly fragile thing. There are severe barriers out there that will actively sabotage you.
Excessive engineering jargon, language differences in a diverse workforce, or even sensory limitations like the literal deafening roar of a factory floor, these absolutely destroy your message. And when communication fails here, workers don't just sit still. They default to habit or they default to peer pressure. They end up non-compliant not out of negligence, but out of ambiguity. They're simply trying to interpret unclear instructions under intense time pressure, so they just default to whatever the guy next to them is doing.
Which brings us to a devastating cultural poison, the danger of tokenism. This happens when management goes through the whole theatrical performance of consultation, but quietly ignores every single piece of feedback they actually receive. If your safety committee functions merely as an echo chamber where no procedures ever actually change, believe me, your workers will instantly recognize the performance, and your reporting culture will collapse overnight. If you ask for their input, you must act on it, or, at the absolute minimum, explain exactly why you can't. Otherwise, complete apathy is the only result you're going to get.
To facilitate real, ground-level consultation, mature organizations rely heavily on safety representatives. And understanding the legal distinction here is totally critical for building those cooperative feedback loops. Union safety representatives are appointed by recognized trade unions, and they possess robust legal powers to investigate hazards and really interrogate safety documents. Representatives of employee safety, conversely, are elected directly by their peers in non-union environments to advocate to the employer. Think of both of these roles not as annoying legal obligations, but as your most vital bridge, the nervous system directly connecting top management to the realities of the front line.
Now, when an incident occurs, it is so tempting to just blame the individual, right? But I want you to trace the anatomy of human error backward, domino by domino. What looks like a single isolated mistake is almost always the final failure in a deep-rooted organizational chain. It usually starts weeks ago in the policy phase with inadequate standard setting. Then it compounds in the planning phase with, say, a poorly designed shift handover. By the operational phase, excessive production pressure is blindly applied. So when the incident finally happens, individual human error is merely a symptom. To actually survive, you must fix the system, not just point the finger at the worker.
You can easily spot an organization that's failing this systemic test because the environment just bleeds indicators of a negative culture. High staff turnover, safety improvements that only magically materialize after someone is loaded into an ambulance, and blame-oriented investigations, those are massive flashing red flags. But you know what the most destructive indicator of all is? Management double standards. If directors bypass safety rules the second schedules get tight, they communicate an unmistakable, fatal message to everyone else. Safety is just a PR exercise, and the culture will rot right from the top down. I want to leave you with a highly practical field test. Tomorrow, walk out onto your site. Stop 3 frontline workers at random, and ask them to describe your safety priorities in specific operational terms. What will they actually say? Well, if their answers are empty, generic phrases like safety first, or worse, if their reality totally contradicts your beautifully written policy, the gap between what you think you manage and what actually happens on the floor is terrifyingly wide. And that gap? That is exactly where accidents live. Closing that gap takes unwavering commitment, genuine consultation, and highly visible leadership. We have now engineered the human framework. We've organized the psychology and the systems. But now, we must step directly into the physical environment itself. How will you identify, isolate, and neutralize the specific hazards waiting for your workers right now? Let's move forward into Element 7 and master the control of physical risk. So, we've built the structure. In Element 6, we lay down the foundations. Organizing for health and safety, allocating responsibilities, getting that safety culture dialed in. But let me tell you a fundamental truth about safety management. A perfect organizational structure, it means absolutely nothing if you can't see the invisible threats lurking right there in your operations. You can have the absolute best policies on paper, but if you fail to anticipate the actual mechanisms that cause harm on the factory floor, or down in the trenches, or even at the desk, the system fails. And when the system fails, people get hurt. And that brings us to Element 7, risk assessment. Think of this as the absolute cornerstone of effective safety management. This is where we learn to identify exactly what can hurt us and how to build impenetrable defenses to stop it.
Section 1. Seeing the invisible. Because before we can even begin to protect workers, we really need to establish a shared language of survival. Confusing your terms here can literally cause your entire protective strategy to just collapse.
Okay, let's dive into this because honestly, this is where so many people first trip up. We've got to shatter the misconception that a hazard and a risk are the same thing. They are not. A hazard is simply something with the potential to cause harm. That's it. It's a trailing cable on the floor, it's a drum of toxic chemicals, or it's a sheer drop from a scaffolding ledge. Risk, on the other hand, is a calculation. Risk is the likelihood of that harm actually occurring, combined with just how severe the outcome would be. You see, risk only exists when a hazard is actually present and someone is exposed to it. So that trailing cable, that's your hazard. But the risk is vastly different if that cable is tucked away in an empty storage room versus running right across the top of a busy set of concrete stairs.
And look, hazards come in so many forms, and they aren't always the obvious things like moving machinery or dizzying heights. We usually categorize them into 5 broad areas. Physical hazards, think electricity, radiation, or noise. Chemical hazards like lead or cement dust. Biological hazards like Legionella bacteria. Ergonomic hazards, which is that wear and tear put on the body through repetitive movement or awful posture. And finally, psychological hazards, things that hold the potential to injure the mind, like severe stress or exposure to highly traumatic events, leading to PTSD. But honestly, the most dangerous hazards are usually the ones you can't even see. Take silica dust, for example. If you're tunneling or spraying concrete, workers can inhale these microscopic, invisible silica particles. Once breathed in, that dust gets trapped deep in the alveoli of the lungs, causing severe scarring and hardening of the tissue. It's a deadly, irreversible condition called silicosis. And the truly terrifying part is that the symptoms can just keep progressively worsening long after the exposure stops. So how do we actually measure the danger of all these hazards? Well, we do this by calculating risk, which is always a combination of 2 factors. Likelihood multiplied by severity. Look at the dice representing likelihood or probability. What are the actual chances this bad event will happen? High, low, almost impossible? Then look at the severity chart. If the event does happen, how bad is the damage going to be? Are we talking about a minor bruise, a serious injury, a major catastrophe, or maybe just some broken equipment? By weighing the probability of an event against the catastrophic potential of its outcome, we finally get our true measure of risk.
Section 2. The 5-step framework. Basically, this is your blueprint for saving lives.
This framework builds a continuous chain of protection, and it goes like this. Step 1, identify the hazards. Step 2, identify who might be harmed and how. Step 3, evaluate that risk and decide on your precautions. Step 4, record your significant findings and, crucially, actually implement them. And finally, Step 5, review your assessment and update it whenever necessary. It's a highly methodical, step-by-step approach to ensure your assessment is what the industry calls suitable and sufficient. That just means it makes a proper check, catches all the significant risks, and brings whatever risk is left down to as low as reasonably practicable.
Let's look at the actual ground-level work for steps 1 and 2. How do we literally find the hazards? Because we definitely don't just guess. We use task analysis. You'll often hear this remembered by the acronym SREDIM. Select the task, record the steps, evaluate the risks, develop safe methods, implement them, and monitor them. We dive into safety legislation and manufacturer data sheets. We comb through past incident logs and near-miss records, because those are just incredible indicators of hidden hazards. And when we're trying to figure out who might be harmed, we have to look way beyond just your average worker. We've got to account for vulnerable workers. We're talking expectant mothers, young people, or workers with disabilities. These groups might have specific physiological needs, or, like with young workers, they might just have a dramatically lower perception of risk. Not all workers perceive danger exactly the same way.
Now, what's really fascinating about the semi-quantitative risk matrix is how it handles step 3, evaluating the risk. It's almost like a giant puzzle. On one axis, you have your likelihood, usually scored from 1 to 5. On the other axis is your severity, also 1 to 5. Multiply those numbers together, and boom, you get a risk rating somewhere between 1 and 25. This visualizes your risk scores into super clear color-coded zones. Green for low risk, yellow for medium, and glaring red for high, completely unacceptable risk. It's a simple, profoundly powerful tool that helps managers prioritize exactly where to spend their time, their budget, and their protective efforts.
But listen, I have to issue a serious warning right here, straight from the examiners who actually grade these assessments. While a numerical matrix gives you great clarity and consistency, you have got to be incredibly wary of formulaic thinking. A matrix is a tool. It is absolutely not a substitute for human judgment. 2 seasoned professionals can look at the exact same hazard and completely disagree on the likelihood. You can't just plug numbers into a grid and turn off your brain. Qualitative expert judgment,
real-world experience, and a deep practical understanding of your workplace, that is what must ultimately guide your final safety decisions.
Section 3. The hierarchy of controls. This right here is where we decide on precautions and actually build our ultimate defense to protect human lives. This is a universally recognized framework, perfectly aligned with the ISO 45001 standard. Picture an inverted triangle, arranged from the most effective safeguard at the very top, trickling down to the least effective at the bottom. Right at the top is elimination, literally just physically removing the hazard entirely. If we can't do that, we move down to substitution, maybe replacing a hazardous chemical or process with a safer one. Next up are engineering controls, which physically isolate people from the hazard, like a heavy-duty ventilation system or machine guarding. Below that, we have administrative controls. This is where we change the way people actually work through procedures, training, or warning signs. And finally, at the very bottom, the absolute least effective control, personal protective equipment, or PPE. I cannot stress this enough. PPE should only ever be your last resort.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly how we apply that hierarchy out in the real world. Let's say our hazard is a massive, noisy compressor that's threatening to cause chronic, long-term hearing loss. The most effective control right at the top? Remove the noise at the source. Just buy a quieter compressor. Boom! We've eliminated the hazard. If that's too expensive or not feasible, we move down to an engineering control. We isolate that noisy beast by putting it in a separate room or installing noise absorption material. If some risk still remains, we drop down to administrative controls and reduce the time workers spend near the compressor by rotating their tasks. And finally, if all of that still fails to bring the risk down to an acceptable level, we reluctantly move to the bottom of the hierarchy and we provide the worker with hearing protection, like earmuffs.
I want to pause here for a second because this is exactly where safety systems fail in real life and where so many students fail their NEBOSH exams. Examiner reports consistently highlight one fatal flaw: jumping straight to PPE. When faced with hazardous substances like that deadly silica dust from tunneling we talked about earlier, too many people just shrug and say, give the workers a respirator. They completely ignore engineering controls. They fail to suggest local exhaust ventilation on the machines or dilution systems that pump fresh air in 15 times an hour. They rely entirely on human behavior, crossing their fingers and hoping the worker wears the mask correctly, hoping it fits, hoping it doesn't fail. Always remember, a technical engineering control will always be more effective than a procedural one, and a procedural control will always beat relying solely on human behavior.
Section 4. The Living Shield. Let's talk about recording and reviewing your significant findings.
Look, it is incredibly easy to view documentation as just tedious bureaucracy. But a written risk assessment, it is a living shield. It is your legal and operational proof that you foresaw the danger and you took real action to stop it. But here's the thing. A shield can rust, and a risk assessment absolutely expires. Step 5 says we must review and update it as necessary. So when exactly does an assessment become outdated? There are 3 main triggers. First, incidents or near misses. If a worker trips or you suddenly get a wave of back pain complaints on the assembly line, your previous assessment obviously missed something. Second, operational changes. Introduce new machinery, hire a different demographic of workers, or alter production process. The risks have fundamentally changed. And third, expiration of validity. Even if absolutely nothing goes wrong, you still need to review these things periodically, usually every 6 to 12 months, just to ensure they're still valid. Honestly, an outdated risk assessment is a truly dangerous risk assessment because all it does is provide a false sense of security.
We have really covered some immense ground here today. You now intimately understand the fundamental difference between a simple hazard and an actual risk. You've got the 5 crucial steps to identify, evaluate, and record these threats. And you know exactly how to build a layered defense using the hierarchy of controls, prioritizing elimination and engineering way before you ever even think about handing out a pair of safety goggles. But eventually, all this theory has to meet reality. Now that you have the conceptual blueprint to assess literally any risk, how do you actually apply it to the messy, unpredictable physical hazards waiting for you right now on the factory floor? How do we tame the massive machinery, the dizzying heights, and the heavy vehicles constantly moving around us every day? Well, that is exactly what we are going to explore as we step into our next critical session, Element 8.
So we've just locked down our hazard and risk assessments. Our perimeter is completely secure. But now we have to introduce the most unpredictable variable of all into the mix: external people. You see, merging your internal safety culture with a contractor's is easily one of the highest risk operations in any modern business. It's like a giant puzzle where the pieces are constantly shifting.
So let's explore exactly how to manage that tricky intersection, and Element 8 covers the management of contractors.
Now, there is a very dangerous psychological trap we see constantly in this industry. It's the illusion that outsourced work somehow equals outsourced risk. You've probably heard it. Well, they aren't our employees, so they aren't our problem, right? Wrong. The data tells a tragically different story. We're talking over 1,000 construction workers dying on the job annually, very often from falls. And here is the harsh reality. When a body hits the floor on your site, regulators absolutely do not care whose logo is printed on the hard hat.
The law on this is absolute. Safety is a non-delegable duty. Under international frameworks like the ILO Safety and Health in Construction Convention and specific national regulations like the UK CDM 2015, you literally cannot contract away your legal liabilities. It's just not how it works. The responsibility is shared. The client, the principal contractor, the subcontractors, and the individual workers on the ground all have overlapping duties. Look, if you're the client, you control the budget, the schedule, and the premises. You are legally required to ensure that the work environment is safe for those you invite onto the site. A failure here isn't just a regulatory breach. It's a profound moral failure to protect human life.
I want you to look at this number, 36. That is the ratio of uninsured losses to insured losses in major contractor accidents within complex industries. Uninsured losses from these incidents, think about severe project delays, massive regulatory fines, destroyed reputational damage, and the loss of future contracts, those can be up to 36 times higher than what your insurance policy will actually cover. A single major contractor accident can absolutely decimate a company's bottom line. Managing contractors effectively isn't just about compliance, it's a critical value-generating business strategy.
So, how do we dismantle this massive risk? We rely on a structured framework. We use the HSE's 5-step contractor management lifecycle. And listen, this isn't just theory. It's literally a chronological blueprint for survival. It starts with step 1, planning. This means precisely defining the job and assessing the shared risks before anyone even sets foot on your site. You've got to identify the site-specific hazards the contractor will face. Is it buried electrical services, hazardous materials? You need to figure that out and agree on the risk assessments up front. Once that planning is locked in, we move to step 2. Choosing a contractor, and what I like to call the pre-qualification trap.
A lot of clients make a catastrophic error right at the start of this phase. They rely entirely on generic paperwork to prove competence. Picking the lowest bid while ignoring true safety capability, that is a straight line to disaster. True competence requires so much more than just holding an ISO 45001 certificate. Honestly, that just proves they managed to pass an audit once. You have to dig deeper. Verify their accident histories, check for enforcement notices, and make sure their operators actually hold the specific trade certifications for your high-risk tasks. Pick up the phone and call their previous references, because on paper, a contractor can look perfect, while their actual execution on a live site is incredibly unsafe.
If someone hands you a generic, copy-pasted risk assessment and method statement, a RAMS, that is a massive red flag. It tells you absolutely nothing about their readiness for your specific site. A site-specific risk assessment, on the other hand, proves the contractor has actually thought through the live, dynamic hazards of your exact environment. It shows us they understand the unique interfaces between the task they are doing and your ongoing operations.
Which brings us to step 3, working on site, and the induction gateway. Okay, so the right contractor is vetted and selected, and they arrive at your gates. This is where we meet the most critical operational control of all, the safety induction. Now, a legal and effective induction is not just some generic safety leaflet handed out at reception by a security guard, and it's definitely not a standardized 15-minute video shown to a demolition crew and a window cleaner alike. It has to cover site-specific risks, emergency muster points, and the actual permit-to-work systems in operation that day. Plus, if you're employing migrant workers, you have to provide this in their native language or use translators. You must verify their comprehension through a short assessment or a practical demonstration, because someone just signing their name at the bottom of a form, that's just paperwork. It is not evidence of understanding.
Think about the anatomy of a real-world disaster for a second. A contractor hands over their RAMs, signs a piece of paper titled Permit to Work at the front gate, and then just walks onto the site to perform a high-risk task. There is no issuer or receiver verification happening at the actual point of the task. There's no two-person check on an electrical isolation. Guys, that is not a permit-to-work system. That is literally just a gate pass masquerading as compliance. When high-risk work happens without formal on-the-spot verification, you are operating completely outside the boundaries of safe work.
Let me be incredibly clear here.
If your permit and induction systems are just administrative checkpoints without any physical verification, you are actively treating an uncontrolled hazard as if it were controlled. The single most common systemic failure we see is the disconnect between induction records and site access. And induction only becomes a real safety control when it is directly linked to physical access. If an uninducted worker can simply physically walk past a gate into a high-risk zone without their status being actively verified, your entire system has failed right at the perimeter. Once they are inside, daily coordination is non-negotiable. Think about it. On any given day, you might have a contractor carrying out hot work, like welding, in the exact same area where another crew is using highly flammable cleaning solvents. The principal contractor has to step up and act as the conductor of this orchestra. They have to ensure these overlapping trades do not create fatal interfaces, and this requires regular meetings, toolbox talks, and just relentless communication to manage those active hazards between different teams.
That flows perfectly right into step 4, active monitoring and supervision.
Listen, engagement is monitoring, and monitoring requires your physical presence. You cannot manage contractors from behind a desk. The greater the risk posed by the contractor's work, the greater your supervisory responsibility is on the ground. You have to balance your approach. Active monitoring means proactive, daily behavioral checks. It's actually walking the site, conducting safety tours, checking that barriers are physically in place, and ensuring PPE is worn correctly. It's verifying that those method statements we agreed upon in Step 1 are being followed in real time. Then you have reactive monitoring. This kicks in when things go wrong, investigating near misses or accidents jointly with the contractor to find the true root causes. Both are absolutely essential to ensure the contractor is held accountable every single day.
Finally, we reach the end of the line. Step 5, reviewing the work.
As the project comes to a close and the contractors pack up their equipment, most organizations just pay the final invoice and move on. What a massive, completely wasted opportunity for organizational learning. Let's talk about how this actually builds your future resilience. You need to sit down and formally capture what worked and what failed. Objectively analyze their incident and near-miss rates. Did their supervisors actually manage their teams? Did they cooperate with the other trades on site? You use this hard evidence to make a definitive decision. Do they belong on your approved tender list for the very next project, or do they need to be permanently disqualified? Because a contractor who consistently performs safely, that becomes a very high-value strategic partner.
The ultimate goal here is to create a fair culture where responsibilities are crystal clear to everyone. By integrating external workers into your organizational culture, providing rigorous oversight, and treating them with the exact same duty of care as your own employees, you completely transform contractor management. You shift it away from being this massive legal and financial vulnerability, and you turn it into a strategic, operational strength. You prove once and for all that safety is a shared, non-negotiable value.
Okay, so we've successfully secured the physical perimeter, we've vetted the documentation, and we've managed the people operating within our walls. But as we look ahead, we face an even deeper challenge. How do we measure the actual pulse, the performance, and the overall psychological safety climate of our entire organization? We have to ask ourselves, when it comes to measuring true safety culture, what metrics actually tell the truth and which ones are just lying to us? Well, we are going to uncover exactly how to measure that invisible culture coming up next in Element 9.
In our last explainer, we really locked down the perimeter. We tackled the whole headache of managing external contractors, setting boundaries, and ensuring their risks don't suddenly become our tragedies. But look, here's the uncomfortable truth. Building this massive, impenetrable fortress against external threats is completely pointless if the floorboards inside your own house are quietly rotting away. So let's jump right into Element 9, the reality check. Now that our external variables are managed, we really have to relentlessly question if our own internal health and safety systems are actually holding up under the everyday pressure of our operations.
Honestly, this is arguably the single most critical question a safety leader can ever ask themselves. Is our house actually safe, or are we just living in an illusion of safety? The big takeaway here is that monitoring and measurement isn't some dry, bureaucratic compliance task. It's not about ticking boxes for regulators so you can sleep at night. It's about gathering critical, life-saving intelligence. It's literally the missing link in so many safety systems, separating the companies that just talk a good game about safety from the ones that actually live it. We have to uncover the ground truth of what's happening out there before tragedy forces us to pay attention. And that brings us to the dark reality of where most companies start, and unfortunately, where way too many of them stop. This is the harsh, human cost of what we call reactive monitoring.
which essentially means you're measuring failure after the fact. We're using accidents, incidents, and ill health as our primary indicators of performance. Just think about the psychology of that for a second. If you rely solely on reacting, well, by the time the data actually reaches your desk, the system has already failed, the damage is done, and someone has already been hurt.
So, what exactly feeds this reactive machine? Well, these are your typical lagging indicators. You've got your accident and incident data, sickness absence rates, near-miss events, enforcement actions, and of course, civil claims. Now, don't get me wrong here. This historical data is absolutely essential. We have to investigate these failures, find the root causes, and fix them. A near miss, for example, is basically the universe giving you a free warning. But relying solely on lagging indicators, it's a dangerous trap. It's the exact equivalent of driving down a dark highway at 70 miles an hour while only looking in your rearview mirror. I mean, sure, you know exactly what you just hit, but you have absolutely no idea what's coming right at you.
And this quote right here completely shatters a massive industry myth. As Fatigue Science points out, a company can go months without a recordable injury and still have serious unmanaged risk. This is a total paradigm shift for your safety mindset. The most dangerous illusion in our entire industry is that zero accidents automatically equals a safe workplace. It doesn't. Actually, scratch that. Sometimes zero accidents just means your workforce has been incredibly lucky. And luck always runs out. We need a system that measures actual success and real risk management, not just the temporary absence of failure. Which brings us to the ultimate showdown, active versus reactive monitoring. The contrast is super stark. Active monitoring means checking standards and identifying risks before the unwanted event even occurs. If reactive monitoring is that rearview mirror we talked about, active monitoring is your forward-facing, highly calibrated radar. It detects the storm before it ever hits your team. It actively verifies that your safety controls are actually working in the real world, day in and day out, instead of just existing beautifully on some piece of paper tucked away in a manager's office. And that forward-facing radar is powered by what we call leading indicators. These are your proactive, forward-looking measures. They track the preventive actions, the daily behaviors, and the overall system conditions. They give us a really clear indication of the direction of our future health and safety performance. These right here are the true drivers of safety. Think about it. If your leading indicators are strong, like if you're routinely completing your risk assessments, getting high attendance at safety training, and fixing identified hazards immediately, then your lagging indicators, those accidents and claims, are naturally going to drop. You are basically predicting the future by controlling the present.
All right, so how do we actually gather this proactive intelligence out in the field? Well, we rely on active monitoring techniques. We've got safety sampling, which looks at representative chunks of a process. We have safety tours by management, which, by the way, are absolutely fantastic for displaying visible leadership commitment right on the floor. We have health surveillance, like routine hearing tests to catch early signs of degradation. But I really want you to focus on general workplace inspections, which are often built around what we call the 4 Ps. Plant, is that machine guard actually secured? Premises, is the lighting in the warehouse hiding a trip hazard? People, are workers actually following the safe behaviors we train them on? And procedures, are our safe systems of work actually viable in reality? By actively inspecting those 4 Ps, we catch the minor deviations long before they have a chance to snowball into major disasters. Now, inspections are fantastic for checking those day-to-day physical realities. But what about the big picture? Let's zoom out to the macro level for a second. Auditing is the systematic, objective, critical evaluation of how well an organization's management system performed. And it does this by examining hard evidence. If an inspection checks to see if a single fire extinguisher is in its place and pressurized, an audit checks to see if the entire fire safety policy is actually effective across the whole company. Are the purchasing protocols for those extinguishers right? Is the training program actually working? Is management even reviewing the data? Audits evaluate the fundamental, structural reliability of your entire safety architecture. And to do this correctly, a truly resilient organization uses a strategic combination of both internal and external auditors. Internal auditors are incredibly valuable because they utilize their deep organizational knowledge to identify nuanced cultural issues that an outsider might completely miss. They know where the bodies are buried, so to speak. But human nature being what it is, they might also be completely blind to systemic flaws they've just grown used to over the years. And that's exactly why we bring in external auditors. They provide high objectivity, specialized expertise, and most importantly, a totally fresh set of eyes. Working together, they cross-examine your systems and eliminate those dangerous hidden blind spots. Okay, so now we take all of this gathered intelligence, from the physical inspections, the lagging indicators, the leading indicators, and those deep dive audits, and we bring it straight into the boardroom.
the management review is what really drives the crucial check and act phases of the plan, do, check, act cycle. Senior leadership absolutely must sit down at planned intervals to look at this data. This is where the sensory apparatus of your safety system, all that monitoring, connects directly to the brain of the organization. And if you don't feed the brain accurate data, well, it's going to make some pretty terrible, costly decisions. When the executives sit at that table, they aren't just having a casual chat about how things feel out on the floor. They need hard, verified data. They've got to review our legal compliance status, the hard accident and incident data, the unvarnished findings from those internal and external audits, whether we are actually hitting our specific safety objectives, and crucially, the status of actions we promised we'd take during the last review. The main point here is this. This is a strategic, high-level evaluation to realign the entire system. It is absolutely not a simple box-ticking exercise. If management isn't deeply engaged here, the culture of safety just rots right from the top down. And that intense boardroom scrutiny, it leads us to the ultimate goal, continual improvement. Listen closely here because this is vital. The entire architecture of monitoring, measuring, auditing, and reviewing is completely and entirely useless unless it culminates in direct, resourced action. The output of a management review cannot just be a meeting minute. No way. It must be documented action plans, revised policies, and newly allocated financial and human resources to actually fix the gaps we found. Our workplaces are dynamic. They are constantly changing every single day. Because of that, our management system has to be in a state of continual improvement, constantly learning, adapting, and evolving to ensure that every single worker is protected by a system that is sharp, effective, and fully alive. Which brings us to a really pivotal moment in our masterclass. We've built the management system, we've learned how to monitor it with leading and lagging indicators, how to audit its deepest flaws, and how to review it at the highest executive levels to drive that continual improvement. But what happens when we step out of the boardroom, take off the suit, and face specific physical hazards right there on the factory floor? How do we apply this incredible theoretical framework to the actual spinning machinery, the toxic chemicals, and the high-risk environments our people navigate every single day? Well, that physical reality is exactly what we are going to tackle in Element 10. I'll see you there. We've just mastered the visible, immediate dangers of the workplace, the unprotected edges, the heavy machinery, the things we can point to. But now we have to turn our focus to the shadows. We're looking at the silent, creeping threats that don't always leave an immediate mark, but over time can be far more devastating to a person's life. I want you to let that staggering reality sink in for a second. One worker every 15 seconds. This isn't just about sudden, tragic accidents. It's about the insidious illnesses that accumulate over a decade of unchecked exposure. It's the slow, irreversible damage happening right under our noses. And that brings us to our first major concept, the silent workplace threat. You see, there's a fundamental difference in how we approach this. Occupational safety deals with the acute, the immediate, like falling from a height or a sudden equipment malfunction. But occupational health? That's the chronic, latent illness. It's the long-term chemical exposure or the slow loss of hearing. Think about it. It is incredibly easy to spot a missing guardrail, but it is vastly more difficult to spot the invisible lung damage a worker is accumulating shift after shift, breath after breath. Failing to manage those invisible threats leads to a staggering cost of illness. We are talking about $1.25 trillion. That massive number represents the estimated annual cost of occupational injury and illness to the global economy. It's an absolute financial drain driven by production delays, compensation payouts, the loss of highly skilled workers, and major reputational damage. In fact, the indirect costs of poor health management are often 8 to 36 times higher than the direct medical bills. But look beyond the money, because here is the real moral failure. Over 2.3 million global deaths per year due to work-related diseases and accidents. That number should haunt us. It is a harsh reminder that no worker should ever have to sacrifice their life or their long-term health just to earn a paycheck. So, the crucial point is that our defense of worker health relies on three main pillars. First, our moral obligation to human life. We simply have an ethical duty to protect our people. Second, our strict legal duties. Compliance with national frameworks is non-negotiable. Ignoring them can lead to massive fines or even imprisonment. And third, that undeniable financial reality we just discussed. You literally cannot build a sustainable, profitable business while actively eroding the health of the very people building it. To build our defense, we need to know exactly what we're fighting. Let's break down the 5 faces of danger.
The NEBOSH framework defines 5 distinct profiles of workplace stressors. We have physical hazards, like extreme noise and temperature, chemical hazards, like toxic dusts and industrial solvents, biological hazards, such as dangerous viruses or bacteria, ergonomic hazards stemming from awkward, repetitive postures, and finally, psychosocial hazards, which is the immense psychological pressure placed on our minds through extreme workloads, stress, or workplace harassment. Let's look a little closer at chemical hazards. When we talk about these, we are really talking about a ticking clock against a worker's quality of life. Seemingly harmless dust like silica kicked up from cutting concrete or even fine wood dust can act as a potent asthmagen, permanently restricting a person's breathing, or worse, it acts as a carcinogen, leading directly to cancer. The health risks from things like respirable crystalline silica are entirely preventable, but only if we actively control that invisible dust. Now, let's put a spotlight on 2 specific physical hazards you'll find on almost every industrial site: noise and vibration. Imagine a worker gripping a heavy grinder or a jackhammer all day. They aren't just dealing with immediate muscle fatigue. They are risking hand-arm vibration syndrome, or HAVS. This is permanent, irreversible damage to the blood vessels, nerves, and muscles, often referred to as vibration white finger. It completely robs them of their manual dexterity, their sense of touch, and ultimately their ability to work. And the scariest part, once that damage is done, it absolutely cannot be undone. Now, practically speaking, how do we control that vibration risk out on the site? We use a brilliant, universally understood setup, the traffic light system. It's exactly what it sounds like. Green means the tool is safe to use for up to a full 8-hour shift. Amber restricts usage to just 2 hours. And red, that literally means stop. Refer immediately to a supervisor. It takes all that complex exposure data and makes it instantly actionable for the person actually holding the tool. And just like vibration, incessant noise is a massive physical hazard. But it doesn't just damage the physical eardrum over time, leading to deafness. It drastically elevates stress, disrupts communication, and creates extreme psychological fatigue. And that fatigue creates dangerous secondary safety hazards. Think about it. If a worker can't hear a reversing truck's warning alarm because of noise-induced stress or hearing loss, a long-term health hazard has suddenly become an immediate fatal safety hazard. All right, so we've identified these silent killers. Now, how do we neutralize them? Through control and health surveillance. We apply the exact same rigid hierarchy of controls here that we use for standard safety. We always strive to eliminate the hazardous process entirely, maybe by using precast concrete instead of cutting it dry on site. If we can't eliminate it, we substitute it or use engineering controls and then administrative controls. We only ever fall back on putting a respirator or ear defenders on an individual worker as our absolute last line of defense. What this means is changing our actual daily behaviors. For example, outline the incredibly common but incorrect practice of dry sweeping hazardous silica dust, which just pushes that invisible poison right back into the air we breathe. Instead, we have to engineer the hazard away. We do this by using wet methods to suppress the dust or specialized industrial vacuums with local exhaust ventilation to pull it right out of the air at the source. When we can't completely engineer the hazard out of the environment, we have to manage the clock. This is where administrative controls shine. We utilize strict job rotation and enforce mandatory rest breaks. This ensures that no single worker ever exceeds their safe daily exposure limit for noise, vibration, or toxic chemicals. It's really about sharing the load to preserve everyone's health. But because a residual risk almost always exists, even after all our best controls are in place, proactive health surveillance becomes our ultimate safety net. We implement routine lung function tests to monitor for asthmagens or grip and touch sensitivity tests for vibration. We do this to catch the very earliest whispers of illness, allowing us to intervene long before a worker's life is permanently altered. We've laid out the technical blueprint to protect human life from both those visible impacts and the invisible illnesses. But look, here is the brutal reality. All of this theory, all of these beautifully engineered controls and traffic light systems, they fall apart in an instant if the people on the ground don't actually believe in them. We now know how to protect a worker's health for a lifetime. But how do we build a resilient organizational culture that guarantees these controls are respected even when nobody is looking? Well, that brings us to the fascinating psychology of human behavior and safety culture, which is exactly where we are going next.
In our last element, we spent a ton of time building these incredibly robust hazard controls. We engineered safe systems of work, we established strict permits, and we put up physical barriers. Basically, we did everything by the book to protect our people. But here's the hard, unavoidable reality of health and safety. Complex systems and human beings will eventually fail. The holes in the Swiss cheese will perfectly align. And when those defenses inevitably break down, the way we respond in that exact moment determines whether that failure becomes a final tragedy or a crucial, life-saving lesson. This is Element 11, Incident Investigation. It's the final piece of this masterclass, and honestly, perhaps the most profoundly important.
Because when risk controls fail in the real world, it doesn't just look like a little red mark on an audit sheet. It looks like a worker injured on the ground. It looks like shattered scaffolding, completely stalled operations, and lives permanently altered. The stakes here are absolute. When a failure happens, a thorough forensic investigation is very often the only thing standing between a near miss today and a fatal disaster tomorrow. At this point, we are no longer just managing safety, we are literally dissecting failure to save lives.
Section 1. The language of incidents and the stakes.
To be effective investigators, we first need to strip away all the emotion and use precise, forensic vocabulary. We have to categorize these failures objectively. Now, there is a chilling distinction between our two most common terms here. An accident is an unplanned, unwanted event that actually leads to injury, damage, or loss. But a near miss? That's an event that had the exact same potential to cause harm, but didn't. Think of a worker dropping a heavy brick from a 5-meter-high scaffold. If it shatters on the empty ground below, that's a near miss. If a coworker steps into its path just a split second earlier, it's a tragic accident. The only difference between those two outcomes, pure arbitrary luck. And that is exactly why we must treat every single near miss as a free warning.
And we've got to remember that adverse events aren't always sudden, violent impacts. Work-related ill health can be a slow, quiet failure. We're talking about severe dermatitis from prolonged oil exposure, or the slow, silent scarring of asbestosis deep in someone's lungs over decades. Whether it's a sudden, terrifying fall from height or the gradual onset of a respiratory condition, both require the exact same rigorous investigation.
So that brings us to a crucial question. Why do we actually investigate? Well, let me tell you what it's not. The ultimate purpose is never, ever to apportion blame. If you start an investigation trying to find someone to punish, people instantly become defensive, the truth gets buried, and you fail, period. We investigate to identify the immediate and root causes, to actually prevent a recurrence, to fulfill our legal duties, and to systematically update our risk assessments. Plus, it protects staff morale. Choosing not to investigate basically tells your workers that you simply do not value their safety.
Section 2. The 4-step investigation framework.
The moment an adverse event occurs, absolute chaos usually follows. As safety professionals, you need a mental map, a rock-solid, systematic framework to navigate that chaos objectively. Here is your 4-step forensic process. Gather, analyze, identify, and implement. But, and listen, this is a massive but. Before step 1 even begins, your absolute, non-negotiable priority is the safety of the scene and casualty care. Is the area even safe to approach? Do we need to kill a live electrical feed before rushing in? Once the injured are receiving first aid and the area is locked down and secured, only then does the formal investigation actually start.
So step 1 is gathering the facts. You're going to need physical evidence, clear photographs of the scene, the broken ladder, the spilled chemicals. You need verbal evidence, interviewing witnesses quickly and entirely separately before their stories start to merge together. And you need written evidence. Pull the permit to work, grab the maintenance records, check the training logs, question everything. You have to be completely objective here, setting aside any preconceived ideas you might have about the people or the equipment involved.
Section 3. Beyond the immediate cause. Digging deeper. Once we have the facts laid out, we enter the most critical phase, the analysis. This is where we put on our detective hats and penetrate the layers of causality to find those hidden holes in the organization's defenses. Think of causality using this really simple but powerful metaphor. An incident is like a weed. The immediate cause is just what you see above the surface, the oil spilled on the floor, the missing machine guard, the worker actually slipping. If you just grab a mop and clean up the oil, you've literally only cut the leaves off the weed. Sure, it provides a nice short-term fix, but the weed is absolutely going to grow back. To truly prevent this from happening again, you have to dig up the root. To find that root, we rely on analytical tools like the 5 whys technique. It's incredibly effective. Let's say a worker, John, breaks his leg. Why? Well, because he fell off a ladder. Okay, why? Because the ladder slipped on the floor. Why? Because it wasn't tied off properly.
Why? Because John was working entirely alone without the correct access equipment. Why? Because the management system completely failed to plan the work at height properly in the first place. Boom! Suddenly, we've moved way past John's initial slip, and we've unearthed a massive systemic failure in work planning. We just found the root.
Section 4. Understanding human failure.
Tracing that root often leads us right into the most complex and wildly unpredictable variable in any workplace, the human mind. I mean, why do genuinely good, highly competent people make errors even in incredibly well-designed systems? When we break down human failings, they generally divide into two main camps, errors and violations. Errors are totally unintentional. They're skill-based, like slips, say flipping the wrong switch on a control panel you use every day, or lapses, like forgetting to disconnect a pressure hose just because your phone rang and distracted you. Then you have mistakes, which are actual errors in judgment, like applying the wrong rule to an unfamiliar situation. Violations, on the other hand, are deliberate deviations from the rules. Think of cutting a corner just to save some time. But here's the catch, even violations are highly predictable.
The crucial takeaway here is that human errors and violations do not happen in a vacuum. If an investigation report simply concludes with operator error, that is rarely, if ever, acceptable. We have to ask what influenced that specific behavior. Was it a job factor, like impossible time constraints or a terribly designed control panel? Was it an individual factor, like extreme fatigue or just a really poor perception of risk? Or was it an organizational factor, like a complete breakdown in communication during a shift handover? Look at the catastrophic Piper Alpha disaster. The root causes there included poor maintenance procedures, lack of training, and a massive communication failure. The system itself created the exact environment where that human error was inevitable.
Section 5. The reality of reporting and systemic change.
All of these brilliant forensic techniques we've discussed, they are completely useless if we don't actually know an incident occurred in the first place. So how do we guarantee that incidents, especially those free warning near misses, are actually reported? The grim reality is this: workers will hide near misses if they are terrified of a blame culture. If a worker feels they're going to get disciplined for reporting a close call, they'll stay silent. If your reporting procedure requires filling out 20 pages of mind-numbing paperwork, they'll stay silent. If they believe management doesn't even read the reports anyway, total apathy sets in. It is absolutely leadership's job to violently tear down these barriers and build a just culture where reporting is openly praised, not punished.
Once an incident is actually reported, fully investigated, and the real root cause is identified, we arrive at step 4, the action plan. Listen, the most brilliant, forensic, 50-page investigation report in the world is entirely useless if it just sits in a desk drawer gathering dust. The findings have to be translated into SMART objectives: specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. We have to assign real costs, name specific individuals who are responsible, and put a hard deadline on exactly when that missing machine guard will be replaced or exactly when that outdated training program is going to be completely rewritten. And I really want to pause on this quote directly from the UK's Health and Safety Executive Guidance. The root causes of almost all adverse events are failings at managerial level. Just let that sink in for a second. This profound truth permanently shifts the ultimate responsibility away from the worker who just happened to slip on the oil and places it squarely onto the leaders who designed the system that allowed the oil to spill, allowed the training to lapse, and allowed the hazard to go completely unnoticed.
As we close this explainer and, indeed, this entire masterclass, take a step back and look at the big picture. We've gone from understanding the legal foundations of safety to deeply analyzing risks, to building physical controls, and now to forensically investigating the gaps when things go wrong. Your role moving forward isn't just to fill out compliance forms and checkboxes. Your role is to look past the obvious symptoms, dig up the deep-seated roots, and fundamentally transform the culture of your organization from one of finger-pointing into one of relentless, passionate learning. Your diligence, your objectivity, and your courage to hold complex systems accountable is what truly builds a legacy of safety. So I'll leave you with this one final question. When the very next near miss happens on your watch, will you sweep it under the rug to protect the status quo, or will you have the courage to dig up the root?